64 game, retro gaming goodness.
Hey, Bastish Bia, and welcome to 64K. Okay, so welcome to my new show. It's called New Retro, and what's the show going to be about? Well, I'm going to take a look at new games made for old systems, anything from the Atari 2600, Commodore 64, Sega Mega Drive, Sega Saturn, it doesn't really matter, anything old. So each episode is going to be split into like kind of two parts. Basically, all these new games that are made for old systems are usually homages or like taking references from older games and kind of making them better for the most part. So today's game, we're going to look at Galaga and Galencia. Galencia has come out for the Commodore 64. Galaga is a retro arcade game. We're going to look at both of them. Okay, so let's first look at Galaga, the game that inspired Galencia. In 1981, Japanese gaming company Namco released Galaga in the arcades. It was a sequel to their own, Galaxian, that came out in 1979. The game itself is a variation on Space Invaders, with you blasting alien bugs from level to level, all 255 of them, with bonus stages and the ability for the enemies to steal your ship, which is one of its most unique features. I always loved playing this game in the arcades as a kid, and the game often appears on top 100 lists that I've seen over the years. Since the time of making Galaga, Namco have made many variations on the game. I'd highly suggest checking out Galaga Legions on the Xbox 360 and PS3 for a really brilliant variation on this game. And if you want to play an arcade perfect rendition of Galaga itself, check out Namco's arcade game series on the Xbox One. But for now, let's end this little history session with this clip.
That man is playing Galaga. Thought we wouldn't notice, but we did.
Okay, so let's jump on over and check out Galencia. Galencia was programmed by Jason Aldred and released for the Commodore 64 through Protovision Games in 2017. The game is a massive homage to the aforementioned Galaga, and in many respects, in at least my opinion, it's a better game than the original. Attention to detail is in high order, from the cool loading SID music to the fun intro sequence that really sets the tone for this exceptionally well-made game. The story is cheesy B-movie fun where we let the bee population of Earth almost completely die out, and now the bee space guardians are here to attack Earth. Your character also gets to pilot the 1981 Galencia ship, which is an obvious reference to Galaga itself and its release date, and have to blast all the bugs and defend Earth from the bee domination. What I really like about this game, and you're probably going to hear me say this in the future episodes of the series, but although the game is retro in look and the system it's on, it still manages to feel like a modern game. The ship feels very smooth. The fire rate is a bit faster than Galaga, so you get to feel a lot more lethal, and it pumps up the fun factor as the pace feels much quicker through the 50 levels the sucker has to offer. There are also two types of bonus stages, one being the traditional shoot the swarms without missing a shot kind of deal, just like Galaga, but the second one has you flying through an asteroid belt, just trying to survive, all the while trying to pick up these strange stars which boost your score and in turn get you closer to those free lives. The music and sound effects are top notch as well, and we have Pulsepot and Sol Cross to thank for that. The graphics are really nice too, detailed, colourful, and you can see a lot of effort has gone into the smallest of details. And don't just take my word for it, even Julian Regnall from Zap64 gave it a sizzler, so you know this thing is legit. There is also a sequel on the way called Galencia Chaosphere, which is said to be released in late 2018 and may even be out by the time this video is released. This is just a fantastic game whether you play the awesome physical version from Protovision on a real C64, there's both NTSC and PAL versions available by the way, or download it and play it through your Vice emulator. You're in for a damn good time. Okay, thanks for joining me, Bastish B, on the first episode of New Retro. Like I said earlier, Galencia is available from the Protovision website. You can get a digital download, or you can get these awesome physical copies. And Galaga, that thing is available in almost every format you can think of, so you're not going to have any problem finding that game. Anyway, so thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K, and if you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B here, and welcome to 64K. So here we are with another episode of New Retro, and if you've never seen this before, I take a new game made for an old system, and then I take the inspiration behind that game, and we check them both out. So today's games are Monty on the Run, that came out on Commodore 64 in 1985, and we're going to look at Barnsley Badger, which is a new Commodore 64 game that came out a few years ago. Okay, so let's first take a quick look at Monty on the Run, the game that clearly inspired Barnsley Badger. In 1985, Gremlin Graphics released Monty on the Run for the Commodore 64. It was originally designed for the ZX Spectrum computer, hence Monty's visual style. The C64 version was coded by Jason Perkins, who did some other awesome stuff at Gremlin, like Jack the Nipper and Avenger, and the music was by Rob Hubbard of International Karate and Nemesis the Warlock fame, amongst his many other gems. The game was a multi-screen platformer with a similar style to other British games of the time, like Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy. Like the name suggests, Monty was on the run from the British government and has to escape England and beeline it for Europe. So collecting objects, solving puzzles, platforming, and a lot of death make up the gameplay. And it's still a fun romp to put on even now, even though the difficulty would be pretty high for most gamers to handle. This was the third game in a pretty popular series from Gremlin, and was clearly the inspiration for today's other game, Barnsley Badger. Okay, so now let's check out Barnsley Badger, the game that was clearly inspired by Monty on the Run. Barnsley Badger was designed by Trevor Story and released by Cytronic Software in 2016. Trevor Story has been a pretty prolific designer in the last few years on the Commodore 64, making a bunch of really brilliant games like Organism and The Legend of Atlantis, just to name a couple. This, however, is nothing like those, and is a perfect, almost companion piece to the Monty legacy, or more specifically the third game, Monty on the Run. Barnsley, just like Monty, is a down-on-his-luck dude, just looking to make a quick buck. He hears a story about buried treasure in his local graveyard, so being the vagabond he is, he goes to steal it before anyone else so he can pay off his ridiculous debts, or so the story goes. The first thing you'll notice is the Spectrum-styled Monty graphics, which they have been able to replicate so well, yeah, and I absolutely love it. Back in the day I always scoffed at this style of graphics, but honestly, I quite like it now. It feels retro, but just in the right way. Collecting and dodging is the prime gameplay, just like in Monty, but the game is a lot more forgiving than that department, which makes the game more fun to play as a result. Trying to find all the treasure is an absolute blast. Collecting power-ups like the glowy stones, which you use in your slingshot, which is an absolutely awesome addition to the game, and just plain exploring the 120 screens this little beast has to offer is so much fun. In the digital download, you also are provided with a map of the whole game, so it gives you a nice idea of the scope of it and the lay of the land. The music by Andrew Fisher is very cool as well. From the loading tune to the actual game, it's just great stuff. I also like the modern sensibilities, like the checkpoints scattered all over the place, indicated by these blue fire things that make traversing this place a lot more enjoyable. The level design is also well done, and each jump and platform seems to be set up really well to challenge and keep the pace going, as Barnsley moves a bit faster than Monty, so it's a bit of a quicker game, but still retains that Monty feel excellently. If you own a C64 and love platformers, then this is an awesome addition to your collection that is fun, charming, and just the right amount of difficult. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the second episode of New Retro. If you want to find out more about Barnsley Badger, check out the Cytronic website. You can pick up a digital download version of the game, or you can pick up this awesome physical copies. And if you want to find out more about Monty on the Run, probably the easiest way to play it if you don't have an original Commodore 64s with the C64 Mini, it's on this system, so you can check it out that way. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. Cheers! Hey, Bastish B here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. If you've never watched this show before, I take a new game for an old system and then we look at the inspiration behind that game. A lot of the new released games for older systems are inspired by classic video games, and that's what this show is all about. So today we got two games from the classic 8-bit computer generation. and welcome back. So let's first check out the game that inspired Rocket Smash EX, Jetpack. Jetpack was the first game ever released by the then fledgling company Ultimate Play the Game in 1983. The company was formed by the brothers Tim and Chris Stamper in 1982, and Jetpack was written by Chris and the graphics were programmed by Tim, and it was released on the ZX Spectrum initially before being ported to the MSX, BBC Micro and VIC-20. The game was a massive success, selling over 300,000 units just on its initial release only. The simplicity of the gameplay and the very arcade nature of how it played made it a runaway success. It's no coincidence about the arcade feel of the game, as the Stamper brothers were ex-arcade developers themselves, and the influence definitely got infused into the gameplay of Jetpack. The game has you trying to reassemble your spaceship on every level, as well as fuel it up so you can escape, all the while you're getting attacked by aliens or natural disasters as you try to escape the planet. It's simple, but addictive. The game ended up spawning two sequels, Lunar Jetman in 1985 and Solar Jetman in 1990 on the NES. The Stamper brothers eventually sold Ultimate in 1985 to US Gold, who continued the label until 1988. Rare, the new name of Ultimate, bought the catalog back in 1988 and switched the focus to console gaming, and Solar Jetman was released on the NES instead of the 8-bit computers that made the series so popular. You can check out the Rare Replay collection on Xbox One if you want an easy way to play Jetpack if you don't have access to the original hardware. And now let's look at Rocket Smash EX, the game that was inspired by Jetpack. Rocket Smash EX was released in 2015 on the Commodore 64 by RGCD. To say this game is inspired by Jetpack would be an understatement, but seeing as the C64 never got an official port of Jetpack itself, you can think of this as the version for the system. The game was originally released in 2013 as part of RGCD's 16 kilobyte game development competition, and you can think of the EX as meaning this is the special upgraded edition of the game. The basics of the gameplay are exactly the same as Jetpack. Reassemble your spaceship, refuel it, and escape the area. After a few stages, you'll escape the planet and move on to the next one. The first planet is easy, but after that things really start to pick up difficulty-wise, and the game does feature 3 difficulty settings, so you'll never feel like the odds are completely hopeless. The game also has an arcade mode and a story mode. The arcade mode is exactly like you'd expect, it's just level after level of relentless intense action. But the story mode adds cutscenes after every few levels, which show your guy trying to make it back to Earth, but either by his incompetence or really bad luck, he keeps on blowing up the ship, which adds a good dose of humor to the fun of this little game. The further you get, the more hazards appear. Meteors, aliens, and everything is out to kill you. And unlike Jetpack, you also have an oxygen meter, which is ticking down all the time, which is basically making you get on with the game and keep the pace at the max, which I have no problem with in this style of game. Sol Cross, who also worked on Galencia, did the music and graphics, which are both really good, nice and colorful. I really like the loader music for this game, and the sound effects do a good job as well, and even feature some digitized speech. There's a really nice physical cart version of the game you can get from RGCD, as well as a digital version, and the Cytronic website also has a tape and disc versions, so you're covered on every format for this excellent arcade type game that'll definitely have you saying, just one more go, over and over. Game over. Okay, so you're wondering how do I play these? Obviously I would always suggest playing the original versions on the original hardware. Obviously that's not available to everybody. If you want to play Jetpack though, you can play it on the Rare Replay collection on Xbox One with a ton of other cool games from Ultimate and Rare. Excellent compilation by any means. Also you can play it on the Jetpack Refueled game, which is backwards compatible now with the Xbox One. Jetpack is in that game, so that's another easy way to play it. And as for Rocket Smash EX, you can go to the Cytronic website. You can get a digital download, which you can play through your VICE emulator or whatever Commodore 64 emulator you choose. If you want to get original versions, they have it on tape, disc, and cartridge, which is freaking awesome. I'll leave a link in the video description to take you straight to the Cytronic website. And thanks for joining me, BastishB at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, BastishB here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So if you've never watched an episode of New Retro before, the basic premise is I play a new game for an old system. And the thing about all these new games that are being made for older systems is that usually they're inspired by original games, like games that may have come out in the arcade or on the actual system itself. So let's take a quick look at today's games. So as you can tell from the intro, we're covering 3 games today as opposed to the usual 2. Now the main game of focus is the original version of Commando on the Commodore 64, but that game was obviously inspired by the original arcade version by Capcom. And then today's new game is going to be Commando Arcade Special Edition. This came out a couple years ago, and this is basically an enhanced version of the original Commodore 64 port. So let's get started with the originals. Commando was originally an arcade game that blasted its way into the arcade scene in 1985 by Capcom. The game was directed by one of their most talented designers at the time, Takuro Fujiwara, who was also responsible for other classics like Ghosts and Goblins and Bionic Commando. The game itself was a run and gun in the best sense, where you play Super Joe, an American soldier taking out a whole army single-handedly, all the while rescuing captured POWs. The gameplay was simple and addictive, like all good arcade games should be. Keep running, shooting and grenading everything in sight, and was accompanied by an excellent soundtrack score by Tamayo Fujiwara that would become a whole other legendary beast on future ports of the game. Capcom did release a sequel to Commando in the form of Mercs in 1989, which was considered an excellent run and gun game as well. Many versions of Commando were ported, including a remixed NES version, the Amiga and the C64 versions. Now let's jump over to the original Commodore 64 version of Commando by Elite, released in 1985. Yes, the same year as the arcade. Elite, the company, were no stranger to arcade conversions either, as they were going to prove time and time again with C64 conversions of Paperboy, Space Harrier, and the UK version of Akari Warriors. They tasked Chris Butler to program the game, and he was responsible for later C64 gems like 720 Degrees, Battleships, Ghosts and Goblins, and Power Drift. So to say they had chosen the right guy for the job was an understatement. Not only did he get the look of the game really close to the arcade, but it played, in my opinion, slightly better, with the relentless fast-paced action really fully intact. The negatives are that the game is really short, and only has 3 of the 8 arcade levels, and can be completed in about 5 minutes. Having said that, Elite did insist that Chris make the game a single loader, which means the entire game had to be loaded to memory. Therefore, including all 8 levels would have been kind of impossible without making the game multi-loader, which Elite was not fond of at the time, also seen as their excellent but also level-missing version of Ghosts and Goblins proved. Fortunately, somebody hired the C64's Sid Beethoven himself, Rob Hubbard, to do the music, and boy did he deliver. His tune is an extended and vastly superior version of Tamayo Fujiwara's arcade track that is absolutely brilliant, and was completed in less than a day. Now that's efficiency. The game itself has great graphics and animation. Using the spacebar to throw grenades is a little bit awkward, and the game does suffer from some slowdown and sprite flickering, but overall it's a really well implemented fun version of the arcade game that is admittedly short, but well worth your time. Okay, now that we got the inspirations out the way, let's take a look at the new version of Commando on the Commodore 64. 2015 was the year the group Nostalgia released their redo of the 1985 version of Commando and tried to make it a much closer version of the arcade than the original was. If you don't know who Nostalgia is, it's a C64 cracking group that cracks games and makes awesome demos for the C64 demo scene community, and they were formed by Zyron and Mr. Alpha in 1995, and are also responsible for the excellent redo of Ghosts and Goblins, which I'll feature in a future episode. So what makes this C64 version so good compared to the already well done original? Well, let's start with the fact that they now have all 8 levels from the arcade intact, a brilliant new title screen, tons of in-game graphical enhancements such as the helicopter from the original arcade version, and they've sorted out the slowdown, and most importantly they've mapped the grenades to a longer press of the fire button, Who Dares Wins 2 style, making the game much easier to control. Naturally, also being a cracking group, we've got an excellent selection of built-in cheats for you to use or ignore at your whim. It's quite an amazing job they have done here, and it really is an impressive upgrade. Now the only thing they did wrong was try to remix Rob Hubbard's original music track, and that was not the best of ideas. it just doesn't sound right. But luckily you get the choice of the remix music or the original, so maybe even they weren't that confident in their own remix themselves. Overall though, it's a brilliant version that is a must play, and you can download it for free from the CSDB site, which I'll put a link to in the video description. Okay, and that brings another episode to an end. If you want to find all these games, the Commando original arcade version by Capcom is available on a lot of their different compilations, shouldn't be too hard to find. The original Commodore 64 version of Commando is available on physical form, on tape and disc. You can also pick it up digitally if you do a search, and you can play it through your VAS or your C64 Mini, it works perfectly. And Commando Arcade Special Edition, the new Commodore 64 version, I'll put a link in the description below, and you can go straight to the place where you can download it. It's free, so that's pretty awesome. I played it on my Commodore 64 Mini also. It's a digital version and it works flawlessly, so you'll have no problem playing that, and I hope you enjoy it. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers! Bastish B for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. Okay, so today's episode of New Retro is going to kind of be a follow-up to the previous episode. In that episode I looked at the three versions of Commando. I looked at the original arcade, the original Commodore 64 version, and the other version made by Nostalgia, which is the arcade special edition also for the C64. So let's look at today's selection. Okay, so let's first have a look at the inspiration behind everything, the original Ghosts and Goblins arcade game, and then we'll segue straight into the original C64 version. Ghosts and Goblins jumped its way into the arcades in 1985 by Capcom. As we saw in the previous episode, Tokuro Fujiwara, who was Capcom's golden child at the time, was responsible for this gem as well. It was released in the same year as Commando. He originally started at Konami before he defected to Capcom, and directed and produced around 60 games for them, including Strada, DuckTales, and Sweet Home. Ghosts and Goblins was a tough-as-nails platformer, with you controlling Arthur, a knight out to rescue his girlfriend from Satan. So a nice little innocent story all round. The game has you running around, jumping and avoiding death, which comes at you relentlessly. You're able to pick up different weapons which aid you in your quest, but your real weapon, in the arcade version at least, is the amount of quarters that you just happen to have in your pocket at the time. 8 levels of humiliation await you in this gorgeous 2D platformer, with excellent music soundtrack by Oyako Mori, who also did memorable work on Capcom's 1942. Now let's switch gears and look at Elite's original 1986 conversion of Ghosts and Goblins for the Commodore 64. Elite were no strangers to quick arcade conversions, as proved by 1942, Bomb Jack, and many others that they pumped out in record time. Ghosts and Goblins came out in less than a year after the arcade debut, and Elite tasked Chris Butler again with the conversion, no doubt based on his lightning-fast conversion of Commando a year earlier. Again, like Commando, Elite wanted the game to be a single loader, so what that meant was sacrifices needed to be made. And just like Commando, the game is missing a few levels, but overall it's still an amazing 8-bit version of the arcade powerhouse. Chris again managed to get the look and feel of the game extremely close to the arcade, which was quite a feat at the time. I got this game for my 11th birthday and managed to load up the tape version before school that morning and got a couple games in, and boy was I impressed. This time around they got Mark Cooksey to do the honors of the music, and it's actually not the same as Osaka Mori's arcade track, but it's its own brilliant beast that only the C64 SID audio chip could provide. Fantastic stuff. Considering the fact that this game was a single loader, it manages to pack a lot of the game into a small amount of memory, and is definitely one of the top 10 C64 arcade conversions that every Commodore 64 owner should play. Okay, now let's look at the new revamped version of Ghosts and Goblins by Nostalgia. Nostalgia did it again with this 2015 redo of the Elite original Commodore 64 version, dubbed the Ghosts and Goblins Arcade. Just like their redo of Commando, the attention to detail is amazing, from the new title screen which adds all the missing details from the arcade back, graphical enhancements on every level. All 8 arcade levels are now included. new music for every stage, and the original arcade intro has been recreated. And with Nostalgia being a cracking group, you now have a full page of cheats to activate before playing, which with this game you may actually need. I really love that they included many of the monsters and bosses missing from the original, and it makes the game way harder, but it also makes the game feel complete. And for that, I applaud them. Here's hoping that they'll tackle Elite's mediocre 1942 conversion next, and maybe give it the conversion it actually deserved. Overall though, Nostalgia did an amazing job on the graphics, and adding new music to each level is really nice. Even though the tracks aren't as memorable as Max Cooksey's original theme, there is a lot of them, and the variation is really appreciated. Check out Ghosts and Goblins Arcade on your C64 or your C64 Mini. It's another 8-bit gem that is begging for a playthrough. Okay, there was some really excellent conversions and redos there. So if you want to find out where to get the original Ghosts and Goblins arcade game, it's available on all these compilations, it's available everywhere, it's a very easy game to find, the original arcade version. So many Capcom compilations have it. As for the original C64 version, you'll still be able to find it on disc and tape if you do an eBay search. If you want to find a digital version to play on your C64 Mini, just do a search for Ghosts and Goblins online, you'll find it within seconds. As for the Ghosts and Goblins Arcade Edition for the C64, I'll leave a link in the description, in the video description. It'll take you straight to downloading that game. It's free. It is excellent. I highly recommend playing it. It's probably the best 8-bit version that I've ever played. You can also have a look at my previous episode of New Retro where I had a look at the Commando Arcade Special Edition, also by Nostalgia. It's very cool. And thanks for joining me, BastishB at 64K. If you can like and subscribe, that will be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, BastishB here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So for anybody that's never watched an episode of New Retro before, if this is your first episode, what the show is about, I play a new game for an old system, and then we have a look at the inspiration game behind the new one. Usually it's an old retro game as well. Which leads us to today's games. So let's first have a look at the inspiration game, the original arcade version of Donkey Kong Jr. Donkey Kong Jr. was released in the arcades in 1982 by Nintendo and is a direct sequel to the classic Donkey Kong, only this time the roles are reversed. Instead of Mario being the hero, he's now the villain, imprisoning Kong, with Jr. trying to free his dad from Mario's clutches. The game was a side-scrolling platform game with 4 stages of brutal difficulty. The Nintendo royalty that worked on this game is quite impressive, to say the least. Shigeru Miyamoto was the director, as well as performing graphic duties, with Yoshio Sakamoto, who went on and created the original Metroid game. And to round out the stellar team, it was produced by Gunpei Yokoi, who ended up creating the original Game Boy, as well as the Game & Watch series, which I actually owned the original Game & Watch version of this game as a kid. This was only Miyamoto's second arcade game as a director, and he truly understood the fundamentals of what made an addictive and well-designed game, even from his early days. The game was extremely popular and it was quickly ported to many home systems of the day, including the Atari 2600, ColecoVision, Intellivision, and obviously the NES. But for some reason it never got a C64 port, which is pretty odd, seeing as the original Donkey Kong got 2 different ports on the system, one from Atari Soft in 1983 and one from Ocean in 1986. Why the Commodore 64 never got a Donkey Kong Jr. port is unknown, but that all changed finally in 2014. Now let's look at the new game that was inspired by this. Yes, 2014 was finally the year the wait was over. 32 years after its initial arcade release, we finally got to see an unofficial port of Donkey Kong Jr. on the Commodore 64. The game was headed up by Austrian programmer, musician and graphic artist Andreas Varga, who was also known as Mr. Sid in the C64 demo and music scene, with Mikhail Hestrup on music and Steve Day sharing graphic duties with Varga. This also happens to be most of the same team responsible for another brilliant 22 years later unofficial port of Prince of Persia also to the C64 in 2011. As far as an arcade port goes, I'd say this is probably the best 8-bit version of Donkey Kong Jr. out there. From the awesome loader title screen to the excellent well-animated and colorful graphics that take full advantage of the C64, they really managed to get the look and feel of the game very close to the original. In fact, if it wasn't for the missing little intermission screens between levels, it would be almost a perfect port, with all 4 levels recreated excellently. The best part about the port for me is the included difficulty settings, which finally makes this game playable for mere humans, and the much improved sound of the little musical scores is also quite a nice touch. Not only did they do an exceptional port of this game, but personally I actually enjoyed this version way more than any other one I've ever played, and for that I think it's a total success. So if you want to play any of these games, the original Donkey Kong Jr. arcade game is available out there. I'm not putting any links to any Nintendo stuff, so I'm just staying away from that. But the unofficial port to the Commodore 64 of Donkey Kong Jr., I'll leave a link to the CSDB site for that, and you can download that sucker for free. And thanks for joining me, BassHB at 64K. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers! Hey, BassHB here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So for anybody that's never watched an episode of New Retro before, or this is your first episode, what the show is about, I play new games for old systems, and then we also have a look at the inspiration game behind the new game, which is usually something retro as well. Which leads us to today's games. So let's first have a look at the inspiration game, which is Neptune's Daughters was a very early Commodore 64 release coming out in 1983 by English Software. They're probably best known for the Night Game series. You as a diver have to rescue Neptune's daughters who keep getting kidnapped by this giant sea snake, who will release them if he's fed enough crabs. Once this is accomplished, the game starts again, but just harder with double the enemies. This style of fast and frantic gameplay with the rinse and repeat mechanic was a common gameplay style during this period of gaming, taking their cues from old Atari 2600 games and of course the stylings of the arcades at the time. It was one of the first games I played on the system and was quite memorable, even though it is extremely short. Gameplay wise, speed is a major factor and the game runs real fast. Armed with a spear gun and limited oxygen, you have to blast your way through jellyfish, plants and crabs to get to the giant snake, feed him, and free a daughter. The game actually plays really well and is very fast paced. Graphics are pretty good for the time, simple but do the job quite well, and the music is non-existent except for a few basic sound effects which work just fine. So the question is, was this game the inspiration for our next game, Exploding Fish? The answer is probably not, as gameplay wise they are completely different, but I feel that the style and themes of the game keep reminding me of it no matter what the gameplay. Now let's look at the new game that was inspired by this. Now let's jump to 2018 with the release of Exploding Fish by Megastar on the Commodore 64. So let's first address this hilarious send-up of the original Exploding Fish game cover that was done. That is absolutely brilliant and immediately captures your attention, especially if you're an old school C64 fan. Story-wise, the evil Dr. Drax has planted bombs all over a number of underwater reefs, and it's your job as Diver Dougal to defuse them, saving the environment and taking down Dr. Drax once and for all, like the dodgy Bond villain in The Spy Who Loved Me. Gameplay has you swimming down to pick up decryption keys in a certain order that can be used to defuse the bombs. The game's pace is completely opposite to Neptune's, with a slow, more methodic style, waiting and watching enemy patterns, and then making your move. You don't have a spear gun in this one, but keeping tabs on your oxygen is a common thread, and various other power-ups can either have a positive or negative effect. The slow gameplay style is probably going to be a bit weird for newbies, but I like the slower pace. It's different from most modern releases and is a nice change of pace, and it reminded me a bit of those Jet Set Willy games where waiting and timing your move is everything. The graphics have a Spectrum style, looking like early platformers like Monty on the Run and Manic Mana. I kinda like the retro style. The music is excellent across the board, from the opening loader by Anders Rodal to the brilliant and fun in-game music by Andrew Fisher, who did some of my favorite recent C64 tunes in Barnsley Badger, and you have a great new entry to the ever-growing C64 library. But before we end this, let's address one of the most obvious similarities between this and Neptune's daughter, that being the Dava and Dava-Dougal. Yeah, that's the same guy, right? I posed this question on my Twitter account saying, is it just me or does the Dava dude look like the guy from Neptune's Daughters? Luckily, coder and designer Chris Stanley, whose this was his first game by the way, cheekily responded, no, that was his cousin. So there you have it. They both exist in the same universe, which begs the question, could this be considered a sequel? Okay, so if you want to play any of these games or buy any of these games, I'm going to leave a link in the description to both of them. So for Neptune's Daughter, I'm just going to leave a link to the CSDB site. And as for Exploding Fish, I'll leave a link to the itch site. It has tons of other Commodore 64 games there to download as well, which is awesome. They all are really cheap, only costing you a few bucks for the most part. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So if you've never watched New Retro before, I take a look at a new game that's been released for an older system, and then we also take a look at the inspiration game that might have inspired it. So today we're going to have a look at 3 games, so let's check them out. Okay, so let's jump over to the first Bruce Lee release in 1985. Bruce Lee was developed by Datasoft and released on the Commodore 64 in 1985. This is a licensed game based on Bruce Lee, the 1970s martial arts phenom himself. The game is an action platform game that has Bruce trying to reach the Wizard's Tower. Along the road to said tower is room after room of death and puzzles waiting to be solved. Collecting lanterns open secret doors in the ground and walls. Deadly traps are all over the place, from fireballs out the walls to electric floors of death. They're all waiting to try and take you out. You also have Yemo, a dodgy green Buddha dude, and his ninja sidekick to deal with as well. They are trailing you throughout the whole quest, and disposing of them with a few well-timed kicks or hitting them into traps is a way of taking them out for a bit until they rematerialize. The 2-player mode in this game is excellent, allowing a friend to take control of Yemo, and the game becomes a co-op adventure with Yemo, in theory, keeping the ninja at bay so you can solve the puzzles. It's an excellent addition and one of my favorite co-op games on the C64. The graphics are simple but do the job well, and Bruce controls easily and is quite simple to get to grips with. The intro music is really cool and gets you in the mood for the adventure ahead, and is another one of those hard to get out of your head once you heard it once kind of tunes. Checking out Datasoft Zorro is also highly recommended, as it has a lot of the same gameplay mechanics as this. Overall though, Bruce Lee is a must-play C64 game. It's short, very memorable, and all the right places. Now let's jump over to the first fan-inspired sequel. Now let's jump over to the unofficial sequel, Bruce Lee 2, which was released on the C64 by Jonas Holton, based on the unofficial 2013 game by Bruno Marcos, which was released on Windows and Linux. Both versions are fan-made. It took Jonas a year to convert the game to the original C64, and the results are quite spectacular. Bear in mind that most of it is not based on the original source code, and almost everything had to be built from scratch. I'll leave a link to the description to his original making of vlog. It's an interesting read. Now back to the game. The story this time has Bruce's sister being kidnapped by some crazy low-pan looking wizard dude, and Bruce has to rescue her from his deadly castle. Henchmen from around the world have been brought in this time, including Kareem Abdul-Jabbar from The Game of Death and Chuck Norris from Way of the Dragon, both classic Bruce Lee movies. The game plays out very much like the original. You progress by collecting lanterns which open gates and secret passages. All the while you're getting attacked by the aforementioned foes and a crazy samurai with a bonus appearance by the original ninja as well. Avoiding spikes, laser floors and landmines is also back. The first thing you're going to notice when you start playing is that the pace is a bit faster than the original. Bruce can also swim now, and the ducking animation looks like he's actually ducking and didn't just get run over by a semi-truck. The biggest change though is the difficulty. It's damn tough, so much so that they had to release an updated version with an easy mode. Most of the difficulty revolved around pinpoint accurate jumping, which is a real pain, but the easy mode rectifies most of that and makes the whole game a lot more fun to play. Graphics and sound are almost a carbon copy of the original, so you feel right at home straight away after starting it up. And I think they did an excellent job creating a sequel to a game which unfortunately never got one. It's well worth your time. Now let's take a look at the latest Bruce Lee release. Bruce Lee Return of Fury is the second fan-made Bruce Lee C64 game to be made and was released by Megastyle in 2019. Story-wise, this one is a direct sequel to the first, where the original wizard dude has rebuilt his castle and Bruce can't help but challenge him, as in the movie Game of Death. Yama and the ninja make their return, and now all three can be human-controlled with Protovision's 4-player adapter, making this the ultimate Bruce Lee multiplayer experience. Gameplay-wise, because coder DMX, who did this sequel, used the original source code, this game feels exactly like the original with all its quirks intact, and makes it feel a little bit more authentic than the previous game. Collecting lanterns, avoiding traps all make a return, and the new screens are well implemented with really great, well thought out level designs. Difficulty is probably on par with the original, meaning it's quite easy but a real fun experience. Graphics and sound are pretty much a carbon copy of the original, with the inclusion of an excellent title screen and brilliant loader music by Anders Rodal, who did the awesome loader music in Megastyle's Exploding Fish. I had so much fun with this new release and would highly recommend it to any classic fan of the original, and I think it stands alone as a really great game for newbies to the C64 as well. Okay, so where can you find these games? The original Bruce Lee was available physically. It was a commercially released game, so I can't leave any links to it. As for Bruce Lee 2, it's available for free. It's a fan-made game. I'll leave a link in the description. As for Bruce Lee Return of Fury, that is available from the Megastyle website. I'll leave a link to it as well. It's also free. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K, for another episode of New Retro. If you could like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish BL for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So if you've never watched this series before, basically I take a look at new games for old systems, and we also have a look at the game that might have inspired it, the inspiration game. And today's games are... Okay, so let's first take a look at the possible inspiration game. Rastan Saga, or just plain Rastan as it's known in the West, was released by Taito in 1987 in the arcades. Taito were a powerhouse arcade company that produced countless arcade hits in the 80s, including two other gems in 1987, namely Arkanoid 2 and Rainbow Islands. Not only were they the masters of arcade games, but they did many excellent home console games as well. Rastan came out right in the heart of their most fruitful period, arcade-wise, and was a side-scrolling fantasy hack-and-slash adventure game. It had your run-of-the-mill I'm on a quest to kill a dragon storyline, but the presentation was excellent and featured really colourful, well-animated graphics with a great visual style spanning its 6 levels. Slicing and dicing beasts, picking up new weapons and power-ups, jumping on the ropes, all the classic stuff that you expect from this type of game was here and done extremely well. 1987 and 1988 saw many ports of the game to home systems, such as the Master System, MSX, and the C64. Speaking of the Commodore 64 version, this is obviously the inspiration for today's other game, but the difference is it's more of an influence of doing something better as opposed to trying to replicate it. So what I mean is that the original C64 conversion of Rastan was handled by Imagine, and let's just say it's kinda mediocre at best. Gameplay wise, it's slow and very cumbersome with lots of bad jumping mechanics. It tries hard, but it just does not capture the fun of the arcade. Having said that, I did play it quite a lot back in the day, and there was probably more to do with the excellent Martin Galway SID soundtrack that the game was blessed with. Definitely the high point of this version. For C64 owners out there, we are finally vindicated with a new version of sorts of this classic arcade game that definitely turns the tables on this mediocre C64 conversion. And now let's check out the new game. The Age of Heroes was released in the first quarter of 2019 by Cytronic Software for the C64. I've been keeping tabs on this game for a while now, ever since I first found out it was by the same team that did Organism, another fantastic little C64 game. With Akim Volkers on programming duties, Trevor Story on graphics and design, and Soul Cross on music and sound effects, you know this is going to be something special. The story is you have to gather a bunch of stones to get rid of some evil in the land, you know, your usual fantasy nonsense backstory. It's pretty much on par with Rastan's throwaway plot. As you can probably see though, this game is very much inspired by Rastan, particularly the C64 version, but oh, does it do it 1,000 times better. Just like the Rastan arcade, this is a scrolling hack and slash with the ability to pick up weapons and smart bombs and kill all manner of beasts and bosses. There are 15 levels to play through, and you can access them from a map and tackle them in all different orders, although your path will eventually be blocked if you haven't found the stones for completing the levels, which gives you access to new areas. The best part about this game is that you can backtrack and replay any level again, which really helps you upgrade your character, as the game employs some light RPG elements. The more beasts you kill, the stronger you get as you level up. So replaying older levels is key. Visually, I think the stages are really varied and look really good. I love that they are not too long and don't overstay their welcome. Taking out the giant head bosses gives you access to better weapons like a giant axe or improved sword. There is a massive variety in monsters you can fight, and each one can be taken out in different ways. The game feels really good and is not slow and clunky like the original C64 Rastan, but moves briskly and handles quite well. There are also some really nice fantasy-esque tunes to be heard throughout the game. The game is also generally pretty easy, which makes it way more accessible to the average gamer. Also, make sure to check out the excellent music demo that's also included in the game. Overall though, a brilliant tribute to Rastan that stands head and shoulders above the C64 version in almost every way. Okay, so where can you get these games? Age of Heroes is available from Cytronic Software. You can go to their website, I'll leave a link below. You can pick it up in its digital form, or you can pick it up in its physical, which is available on disc and tape in a nice big box, just like that. As for Rastan, the original arcade version, you can check it out on the Taito Volume 1. That was available on the PS2 and Xbox Original. It's an excellent compilation. Probably the easiest way to play the original arcade version anyway. And as for Rastan, the original Commodore 64 version, it was available physically. You can pick up a physical version on eBay, or you can also check out csdb.dk. You can pick up a digital version there. You can do a search, you'll find it quite easily. And that's it. Thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you could like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B up for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. Okay, if you've never watched this show before, basically I take a look at a new game for an old system, and we also have a look at the inspiration game, the game that might have inspired this new incarnation. And today's games are... So first we'll look at the inspiration game, which is definitely the 1990 release of Turrican by Rainbow Arts. This game is a sci-fi run and gun fan's absolutely dream come true. Jam-packed with massive levels to blast and explore, bosses all over the place, and a huge amount of variation in the levels, which there are 13 of, and tons of enemies and weapon design variations. The game was programmed almost single-handedly by Manfred Trenz of Gianna Sisters and Catechus fame, and he throws everything at the screen, pushing the good old C64 hardware to places it never thought was possible. The story is your usual one man against some nut trying to destroy the universe kind of deal, which is pretty pretty standard for these types of games. And although it is a run and gun, it definitely encourages you to explore the levels as they are jam-packed with secret rooms and areas with many awesome weapons to collect and diamonds to grab. Get 300 of these diamonds and you have an extra continue, so collecting those is imperative to completing this game. Not only does it employ horizontal scrolling action, but certain levels switch to vertical flowing destruction where you fly around blasting the heck out of anything that crosses your path. And just like the classic NES game Metroid, you can transform into a deadly orb which makes you invincible as you cut through the enemies and speed through levels, although you can only change into this state 3 times per life. So you better save it for when you find those narrow passages to secret areas or some chaotic screen killing. The game has no in-game music due to everything else melting the C64's boards just to run it, although they do have some really nice intro music by Chris Hulsbeck, and sound effects especially are excellent. You can also check out Hulsbeck's complete Turrican music soundtrack on the Amiga version, which is really quite excellent. A true classic game, which our next subject definitely drew on for its inspiration. And now let's check out the new game. Steel Ranger was released in 2018 by Cytronic Software and is another game by Lasse Arne, whose previous title, Hessian, is another gem that will be covered on this channel at some point. Just like in the case of Manfred Trent's, although this time it is completely programmed by one man himself, including the music, and is a real feat if you have to consider the quality and size of it. Just like Turrican, Steel Ranger is a run and gun platform exploration game, although there is a much bigger emphasis on story with light RPG elements, as well as you can upgrade your suit and weaponry. The story is humanity has left Earth and is attempting to find another planet to colonize, but run into this machine race bent on human extinction. That's where you come in, as your ship is sent to investigate a planet and crashes, resulting in the start of your adventure. The action is a lot less hectic than Turrican, with the exploration aspect much more prevalent. Tons of weapons and suit upgrades, like being able to transform into the ball like Turrican, and the ability to get jetpacks later on, all add massive layers to an already dense gaming experience. There are no levels, and the entire game is made up of 6 massive sections you can explore by unlocking certain areas to progress. Finding secret rooms, tons of variations on enemies to destroy, never mind all the epic boss encounters, make this really stand out as a top quality C64 title on all levels. Graphics and music are quite excellent, and it plays extremely well with its mixture of exploration and run and gun action. This game is also NTSC and PAL compatible and works perfectly on a C64 Mini as well. So head on over to Cytronic and check it out for yourself. So where can you find these games? Of course, Turrican was an originally released game, released by Rainbow Arts, so you can pick up a physical copy of that on eBay, or check out CSDB, you might be able to find a digital copy of that. As far as Steel Ranger goes, you can pick up a digital copy from the Cytronic website. They also had a physical one available. It's in and out of production, so hopefully you can get a physical copy of that as well. And thanks for joining me, BastishB at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you can like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, BastishB here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. And if you're new to this series, basically what I do is I take a look at a new game for an old system, and then we take a look at the game that might have inspired it. And today's games are... Okay, so first, let's check out the original version of Berserk. Berserk was released in the arcades in 1980 by Stern Electronics. This was still the early days of the arcade scene, and every company was vying to grab your attention as soon as you set foot through those arcade doors. Berserk is essentially a maze shoot 'em up, where the goal of each screen is to kill all the robots as fast as possible and exit the level. Gameplay employs classic arcade mechanics with randomly generated levels, and the goal is to last as long as you can and rack up those points. More kills means the robots get smarter and more aggressive, and the difficulty ramps up pretty quickly. But the one more go trope is alive and well, and it's quite an addictive game. You also cannot linger too long on each screen, as the main floaty head bad guy named Evil Otto will come out and try to kill you. He's immortal, so you basically have to kill the robots that are left and beeline it out of there if you see him appearing. The game is a ton of fun to play, and it's kinda surprising it never received more home ports, as the two Atari 2600 and 5200 and a Vectrex port is all that was ever made. There were countless home knockoffs though, like the Commodore 64's own Shamus for example, and they even made a Milton Bradley board game out of it. One of the most attention-grabbing things about Berserk though is its sound, as it's one of the first arcade games to employ digitized speech samples, and there are a ton of them. As soon as you walked into an arcade back then and heard that crazy robot chatter, you just had to go and investigate, which I think made this game way more popular, at least in those early days. The graphics are simple but clean, and I like the minimalistic look, even though it's a product of hardware and not design. Sound is excellent, and after playing this, you're gonna have that robot chatter in your head for a good while. You have been warned. Overall, a nice forgotten early arcade game whose gameplay is still fresh and fun to play even now, so give it a try. Okay, so now let's check out the 2013 version. In 2013, we finally saw Berserk converted to the Commodore 64 in the form of Berserk Redux and released through RGCD. This is another one of those strange games that never got a C64 conversion despite its popularity, as in the case of Donkey Kong Jr., which I covered in a previous episode. Everything as we just saw is exactly the same, and the look and the feel of the game is replicated perfectly here, as is the sound, which this is one of the few versions featuring all the arcade voice samples, which the C64 SID chip replicates eerily well. There's also a nice loader screen and some cool menu music, which adds a little extra to the overall feel of the game. The arcade addictiveness is still fully intact, and you're gonna find yourself coming back again and again to beat that score, which it also supports high score saving to disk, which is needed in a game like this. It's also NTSC and PAL compatible, and I played it on both a real C64 and the C64 Mini, and the game works perfectly on both. This is an excellent conversion by the guys at Element 114 Software and RGCD, and you can tell everybody involved loved the original and really put the effort to replicate it as accurately as possible. A must play. Okay, so you're probably wondering, where can I get these games? The original version of Berserk, the arcade game, hasn't appeared on any compilations ever, as far as I know. So that game is probably best played through a MAME emulator or something like that. That's the only way you can really play it, unless you own the arcade machine. But as far as the Commodore 64 version goes, it's available from RGCD. You can download it from those guys for free, so definitely check that out. It's well worth it. And thanks for joining me, BastishB at 64K. If you could like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, BastishB for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So if you've never seen this show before, I take a look at a newly released game on an old classic system, and then we have a look at the game that might have inspired it, the inspiration game. And today's games are So let's first check out the original. The first version of Prince of Persia was released in 1989 on the Apple II computer and released by Broderbund. The game was in development since 1985 and was started after the massive success that designer-programmer Jordan Mechner had with his previous release, Karateka, the action-adventure classic. Prince was initially a flop on the Apple II, as most of its user base had moved on to newer systems at the time, and the game was quickly ported to DOS, which is probably its most famous version. If you've never played it before, it's an action platform adventure game, taking its inspiration, at least story-wise and style, as Jordan Mechner said, from Raiders of the the Lost Ark and Tales from the Arabian Nights. It's a story of Jafar, the evil wizard who forces the princess to either marry him or die, and he gives her 1 hour to make her choice. Little does Jafar realize that her knight in shining armor is being held in the dungeons below the castle and has to make his way up to her and defeat Jafar once and for all. Gameplay is a bit tricky to get used to initially, but works like a charm, especially playing it on a keyboard, which for whatever reason feels like the most natural way to play this game. Solving light puzzles, picking up items such as a sword and health potions, partaking in sword fights with the dungeon guards, and avoiding all manner of traps is how the game plays out. The biggest element though is the time limit. You have 1 hour to complete the entire game. All 13 levels. A game over is only reached with the time ending, so it's quite possible to get yourself into an unwinnable situation. It's a tough game and not for the easily frustrated. The graphics are really impressive for the time, colourful and vibrant with lots of cutscenes like Karate to tell the ongoing story. The animation is of special note, extremely fluid and realistic, and is its most memorable feature. Jordan used a technique called rotoscoping to achieve this by videotaping live action scenes and moves and then drawing over them frame by frame to achieve the realistic animation. It's brilliant and works extremely well, and has definitely inspired other games like Flashback, for example. The game is one of the most ported pieces of software in computer game history, with over 20 different versions currently existing. Jordan was also involved with the PC sequel, and you should also check out his excellent rotoscoped adventure game called The Last Express, which is a brilliant game as well. And now let's check out the new game. So you would think that with over 20 different versions of this game existing, a Commodore 64 port would have happened. But no, it didn't. It took 22 years and an unofficial port for it finally to appear on the C64 in 2011. And boy, was it worth the wait. The port was headed up by Andreas Rygar, better known in the C64 community as Mr. Sid. He went back to the original Apple II source code to produce this fantastic version, which makes it very accurate to the original game. Besides programming, graphics, and sound, Andreas also had help with graphics by Stephen Day, who also worked on the excellent unofficial Donkey Kong Jr. conversion to the C64, which I covered in episode 6 of this show. Graphically, this game captures the look of the PC version very well, and all the animation and cutscenes are intact, and it has an excellent rendition of the PC music and good sound effects. It's quite an amazing feat. Not only that, but all 13 levels are present, making it a 100% accurate port in terms of keeping all features and levels intact. It's still a damn tough game, but plays really well, with light slowdown in certain sections, but apart from that, it's pretty brilliant. You can play it through emulation on Vice or a C64 Mini, and the game is made possible to run on an original C64 as well as an Easy Flash cartridge, which holds more memory than a standard C64, allowing the game to run perfectly on the system. This is another excellent effort by Mr. Sid and crew, and still proves the old bread box has a lot of life still left in it, and we wouldn't have it any other way. So you're probably wondering, where do I find these games? For the original versions of Prince of Persia, you can check out myabandonware.com. And as for the Commodore 64 version, it's fan-made, so it's free. It's available at csdb.dk. And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. If you can like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B up for 64K, and welcome to another episode of The New Retro. So if you've never watched this show before, I take a look at a new game for an old system. I also take a look at the inspiration game, the game that might have inspired this new incarnation. And today's games are... Okay, so let's first take a look at the possible inspiration game. First, we'll take a look at a game called Rogue, designed by Michael Toy, Glenn Wichman, and Ken Arnold, released in 1980 for the Unix mainframe computer as a piece of public domain software, very similar in the way that the Oregon Trail was released in the early 70s. The game itself was the beginning of a whole subgenre of games called roguelike, and this game is the like in that sentence. The reference would only come along decades later, but the game pioneered all the tropes of these styles of games. Your character has to make his his way down a series of randomized dungeon levels, looting for treasure, weapons and items, with the ultimate goal to retrieve the Amulet of Yendor on the last floor. The game looked pretty primitive even then with its ASCII graphics, but college students were addicted to the game and couldn't get enough of it as it spread between campuses. The tropes it brought were randomized levels, making each playthrough unique, turn-based moves, meaning you could take as long or as short as you wanted, making your next move, and of course that leads to permadeath. No matter how far you got or how long it took, death means your character was gone for good, and this was one of the main reasons why the game was made turn-based, so you could plan carefully and think about all your moves. The game's popularity, especially on college campuses in California, got a major boost in 1983 when Rogue was included in the BSD Unix operating system for many of the campuses around California, thus giving access to the game to even more people at the time. It wasn't until 1984 though that the game would finally get its first of many commercial releases, with the conversions done by two of the original creators, Toy and Witchman, with John Lane joining under the label AR Designs and being supported and distributed by Epix. The DOS version you see here was one of the first releases, as well as the Amiga and Atari ST ports that followed over the next few years. Later in 1988, Mastertronic, under their MAD label, released a bunch of 8-bit ports as well, including the Amstrad, C64, Spectrum and Atari 8-bit versions. The game has always been very simple and basic, while bringing many new ideas to the RPG adventure genre that's still being implemented in roguelike games to this day.
And now let's check out the new game.
And we now jump to 2019 with the release of Trogue 64, Drain of Doom on Commodore 64. This game is an absolute love letter to the classic 80s rogue game, but also bringing its own unique elements to the mix. The backstory is there was a zombie outbreak in the 80s in a small town, but the residents were able to lead the slow-moving horde down to the bottom of an abandoned mine and then flooded it. Unfortunately, the Trogue, or drain in a sense, has been removed, causing the mine to drain. Your character starts at the bottom floor and you need to work your way up all 64 levels to the surface, all the while activating the 8 pumps spread throughout to refill the mine. All the classic roguelike elements are here. Looting for equipment, battling creatures like skeletons, toads, slime, etc., turn-based moves, randomized levels, and of course, permadeath. This game is extremely addictive and feels very modern even though it looks extremely retro. I love the fact that you also have to use the keyboard to play it, just like with the original Rogue. The game was programmed and designed by Wolfgang Botcher, who used to run a number of BBSs in the 1980s. He's got his own website here, which I'll leave a link to in the description, and you can read up on all his latest Commodore 64 projects. The music in this game is fantastic as well, and is done by TDM of the C64 demo group Triad, and is a great atmospheric SID tune. The best part of everything here is that the game is free, so check out csdb.dk. I'll leave a link in the description so you can download it, and it plays perfectly on a real C64 through VAS and on the C64 Mini, although I'd highly recommend plugging in a keyboard obviously for the controls. It's a great game in a classic style, so be sure to check it out.
And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you can like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. Cheers. Hey, Bastish B at 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. So if you've never watched this show before, the premise is I take a look at a new game on an old retro system, and then we have a look at the inspiration game, the game that might have inspired it. And today's games are... So let's first check out the original.
Pango was published in 1982 in the arcades by Sega, who were making a name for themselves, releasing tons of interesting and unique titles during that period, like Star Trek and its vector graphics glory, and Zaxxon with its unique isometric viewpoint, and many other interesting titles. Pango was developed by Corland, who worked for Sega as an arcade developer. Corland themselves later became Banpresto, which later became part of Bandai Namco in 2006. In the game, you control Pango, a crazy little penguin trying to crush these blob creatures that have invaded the Antarctic. Gameplay is fast-paced and frantic, like a lot of the arcades during this period, with you navigating an ice maze and pushing ice blocks around to crush your foes, or electrocute them with the border of the screen to buy yourself some time. It's a really fun game that requires lightning-fast reactions and predicting the patterns of the enemy. It's hard, but once you get into the zone, the game becomes mesmerizing. Another aspect of the game that sticks with you is the music, at least the original music, which is a rendition of an instrumental song from the 1960s called Popcorn that is an absolute earworm that you'll never forget. There are actually two versions of the arcade, one with that as a theme and another with just original music. My guess is that Sega were afraid of being sued and they re-released the game with the original music to cover their backs. I'm pretty sure that's also the reason we've never seen any proper modern releases of Konami's marquee arcade game, as that used a rendition of the Beatles' Hard Day's Night as a theme. Just a thought. Pango itself overall has 16 levels of increasing difficulty, with intermission animations every few levels, just like Miss Pac-Man. The graphics are simple but good looking, with nice colors and animation. It's a tough game initially, but worth the fight to get the flow of its action. It's been re-released over the years in a number of different systems, such as the Atari 8-bit systems, the Sega Game Gear, and even the Sega Mega Drive got an exclusive version in 1995 for Japan only. If you enjoy these single-screen maze arcade ROMs in the Bomberman style, then Pango is going to be right up your alley.
And now let's check out the new game.
Icebox Plus is a total love letter to Pango and games of its style, and was originally released as a cell phone game. It was designed by classic C64 programmer Carl Hornell, who also did Cleanup Service, Fungus, and Velocipede on the C64. Carl decided to convert his game to the Commodore in 2018, which was a perfect fit for the system. The C64 actually got the original Pango version, as well as the really fun clone game, Chilly Willy. The game has you controlling a penguin who is trying to loot gold coins out of the ice blocks for no apparent reason, all the while he's getting attacked by various creatures. Using ice blocks like Pango to crush your opponents and loot the blocks is how you finish each level. The game has a slightly slower pace than Pango, but it gets really intense the more creatures appear on screen. The graphics are very nice and arcadey and have a lot of variety level-wise, way more than Pango. And the music, especially the loaded title, is quite an excellent SID tune and is well worth a listen for chiptune fans. The game is a free download also digitally, but in 2019 it was re-released by Cytronic Software for the C64 in tape and disc format, and is a wonderful physical version to own. I'll leave a link in the description so you can check that out. It's a fun game in a classic arcade way that fits really well gameplay and style-wise on the old breadbox.
And thanks for joining me, Bastish B at 64K. If you can like and subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers! Hey, Bastish B here for 64K, and welcome to another episode of New Retro. And if you've never watched this show before, I have a look at a new retro game on an old system, and then we also have a look at either the inspiration or the original version of that game. And today's games are... So let's first check out the original.
King's Valley was released in 1985 on the Japanese MSX computer by Konami. It's quite a forgotten gem from such a big publisher, but that's probably mostly due to it being on the MSX and only seen a small run DOS release. The MSX was an extremely popular computer in Japan, selling over 5 million units, but its popularity outside of that country was minimal, mainly due to its late release in the 8-bit Western computer market, who was already dominated by the likes of the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. So King's Valley got a little bit lost amongst Konami's big releases. The game was essentially a platform arcade puzzler, where you as an Indiana Jones-styled adventurer was setting about to raid various Egyptian tombs and rob them of their gems. Of course, the place is infested with mummies out to kill you as you try to dodge, stab, and dig your way to those precious jewels before escaping all 15 tombs. It's a really fun and addictive arcade-style game that maybe gets a little bit too hard too quickly, but once you get the flow of it, the gameplay is hard to put down and a ton of fun. The MSX also got an exclusive sequel to the system as well, that unfortunately never got a port to any other computer or console of the time.
And now let's have a look at the new version.
So, 35 years after its initial release, we finally got to see an unofficial port of King's Valley to the C64 in 2020. So how does it stack up to the MSX original? Pretty simply, I would say it's slightly better in my opinion. Just like a lot of new C64 games, it uses the high-res mode to make some really nice detailed graphics, especially on the main character who looks much more detailed than the MSX original. The team also managed to port the entire game as well, all 15 tombs, with a nice music score which pretty much replicates the original exactly. The game was programmed by Mario Mora and has been released through rebitmagazine.rt, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. It was originally slated to be a full commercial release through Cytronic Software, with them even trying to work out some sort of official deal with Konami. But alas, something went wrong and Cytronic pulled out, which means the awesome Steve Day loader screen is now no longer, unfortunately, part of the game. The positive aspect to this is that the game is still available through Rebit, and now that the fact that it's unofficial, it is also free. The game is extremely fun, and you could probably compare it to Lode Runner in terms of gameplay. It's very arcadey, but at the same time it's pretty strategic, and I think it's these elements which make it so addictive, with the main gameplay mechanic being you can only carry one item at a time, so knowing when to pick up a knife or a shovel for digging or jumping your way out of a bad situation, there's a lot of fun to be had. You should check this one out, you'll be pleasantly surprised.
So you're probably wondering, where can I get these games?
As for the original MSX version, eBay is probably still your best bet for a physical cartridge version, although it is pretty expensive. The DOS release is super obscure and goes for absurd prices, if you can even manage to find it, which I couldn't. Alternatively, you can get the Sega Saturn compilation disc, Konami Antiques MSX Collection Ultra Pack, released in 1998, featuring 30 MSX originals, with King's Valley in that collection. As for the new C64 version, I'll leave a link to Rebit's site. It is in Italian, so if you cannot speak the language, you may have to Google Translate it, but I'll link to the download page, or you can get it from csdb.dk, which I'll also leave in the links.
And thanks for joining me, Bassish B at 64K. I hope you had a good time. If you can like and subscribe, they'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.